This is Adam Law once again with a video from Wanderings. Today is a Torah video. And the topic of the video is, it's not God's fault. Evil in the position of Rambam. I wrote a paper about this recently, and my findings regarding the Rambam were so interesting and shocking to me that I thought it would be cool to put my findings in a video. It's basically based on the Guide to the Perplexed. Ooh. So if you're a Breslover, you better not listen to this, or Gronic, because I think they said you're not allowed to learn this stuff. But for the rest of us that feel okay to look at any Holy Jewish Sefer, this book, it's from the third part of the Guide to the Perplexed, chapters 10 through 12, and he discusses the problem of evil. Now, this may not be the comprehensive everything of the Rambam on evil. I'm sure since he was such a prolific writer, he has what to say about it. I know he talks about Eov, the story of Job, as well, in the Guide to the Perplexed, and I'm sure in other places as well he speaks about it. I'm just going to give it over as he presents it here in the Guide to the Perplexed. First of all, I want to say is the Baal Shem Tov 1. If someone were to say what was the main teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was the idea that God is responsible for everything, every single detail of creation. And this is an idea that I believe is really the foundation of our religion as a folk religion. I think even though the Baal Shem Tov said it in a philosophical way in his deep Torahs, nevertheless the average person believes this. This was God's will, and Yirtzeh Hashem, God wanted this is God's will. However, Rambam, or as they call him in the philosophical circles, Maimonides, really has a radical different view, as well as his view is found somewhat in other books as well. The Ramban, for instance, seems to echo some of his views on some of these ideas here of divine providence, hashgacha, even though he is considered a Kabbalist and has a different opinion in a lot of areas. And how the Kabbalah and Rambam interact is not the purview of this particular video. This particular video, I'm just going to speak about, again, the Rambam's view as it seems from this book alone. The major idea of Rambam we know regarding God is that God is not corporeal, physical at all. And there are many hints to this in the Torah as well. And we find 1,000 years earlier in Onkelos. Onkelos, when he translated the Torah into Aramaic, he tried to get rid of as much anthropomorphism using God in human language as possible. We know this is a major idea of Rambam. And the Guide to the Perplexed goes with this idea. So before we get into the question of evil, we have to state that a lot of the view of what evil is based on the fact that Rambam holds that God is totally spiritual, totally beyond. We cannot have any conception of God at all. And any physical attestation to God, even in the Torah where it speaks about God doing certain things or having certain attributes, is just a way for the human mind to comprehend this. That's a big idea in the Rambam, but we find it as well, already found back in the Midrash as well, that everything is really just kind of a story, a hint to God's greatness, but really we can't grasp God in any way. And the Torah just speaks according to the Midrash, and of course the Rambam. God just speaks in the Torah in a human way, in order that we can understand and relate, because we can't comprehend an infinite, awesome, incorporeal being. This is one of the biggest foundations of Judaism. And whether people held that God had some sort of celestial power or figure before that, it doesn't matter. Clearly, since the Rambam, that is what Judaism holds completely. There are some sources like the Ravid, which seems to indicate there were great people who had some conception of God in some sort of corporeal terms, but nevertheless, that's beyond the scope of this. And let's just assume that for sure for now, everyone believes and holds at the Rambam and others that God has no physical form whatsoever. God has no connection to this world as far as what God's essence is. This world is a materialistic place. And this is very important to understand that when it comes to God, when it comes to the view of God and evil. And did God create evil? And is God responsible for evil in the world? I speak about this at length in one of my Tisha B'Av videos, which I will make a link to at the end, Is God Bad? Where I speak about some of the greater other opinions as well on this great subject. But let's just delve right into it right now. Rambam does not believe that God is bad or that evil comes from God. To Rambam, evil is a privation. It's a lacking of something. Good and bad are not two equal sides of the sphere. There is good, God's goodness, and the lack of that goodness is what's called bad. And so bad is privation. It's a lack of something good. For instance, when I see that somebody's sick, that's not, a sickness isn't something in itself, according to the Rambam, but it's a lack of health. Health is a certain status quo, but then bad can come when that is removed, right? So that's an important thing to understand. One, God is totally spiritual and non-corporeal, totally beyond everything, and this world is a materialistic place. And therefore, this world, God does not create evil, he creates great good, but this world is a corporeal place, and the lack of God's good is evil. It's a lack of something. It's not a separate force in itself, like Zoroastrianism, where there's good versus evil. It's not two gods. There's one God, and he is good. The separate sphere, though, is this world. God, as we will see, does interact with this world. He relates with this world, but he's not in this world, so to speak. And this is a very big difference from Kabbalistic and Hasidic points of view, according to the mainstream, that God is actually in this world. God is part of this world. As a matter of fact, we see that in the Midrash, the famous Midrash from Midrash Rabbah, where it says, the world is not a place of God, God is a place of the world. Meaning is the world's inside of God. God's bigger reality than the world. This does not seem to be Rambam's position at all. Rambam clearly states that this world is separate. And what creates evil is that this world inevitably is a materialistic place. It's corrupt. Entropy is the natural state of this world. It is moving towards corruption and entropy. Maimonides, we will see, does say there's actually a good point in that, which we will get to. Clearly, as we said, Rambam does not believe that God creates evil. And he also has a midrashic support from Midrash Rabbah, which states that nothing evil descends from above. So, when we look around, we see there is suffering and evil in the world. The criticism on the Rambam is that he does not seem to focus on the individual. When an individual is suffering, and every individual suffers, he doesn't seem to be concerned that God is responsible for that. He says we can't focus on the individual who's suffering. When we say that God is good and doesn't create evil, we have to focus on the fact that if you look at the whole world as a whole, the heavens and the earth and the beautiful things in the world and how it all fits together, we will see that this thing is tremendously good. As we see in the creation of the world, we see this was good, this was good. We see that over and over again. We see it as a whole, we have to say that God's creation is very good, even though we see there are individual things for an individual that they may suffer from, right? So he points out certain philosophers who say that God is bad based on the suffering of the individual. And he said, again, this is short-sighted. You can't focus on the individual because that's not looking at the big picture. God's overall reality is good. We can't look at the individual, we have to look at the world as a whole. Rambam goes further to defend God and say that God is not responsible for evil. Again, God creates good, but the privation of that good is what we call evil. God does not create evil directly, but creates the potential for evil by a removal of the good. And another factor is, of course, that this materialistic world is constantly degenerating. It's constantly falling apart. Therefore, of course, there is bad in the world because the world itself, it's the nature of the world. And if we don't understand that this world is a place of suffering and loss, then we're going to suffer, right? So that's why. So we expect infinite good when we're living in a finite world. And God's reality, God's good, is infinite and it's beyond this world. God does relate with this world, which we will speak about that in a minute when we speak about God's divine providence. So there are two basic axioms of why evil exists in the world. And one is the fact that materialism corrupts, that the world, a physical place, is always corrupting, it's always going towards entropy. And the other one is the absolute fundamental axiom that people have free will. Meaning is we have choices and our choices have an effect on the world. And that's why the world is the way that it is. Well, that's why bad exists in the world, because of the choices that we make and the choices that others make. Meaning it's not always God's fault. This works well, obviously, with big questions like the Holocaust. With the Maimonides, you could say, God only created good, but people removed good. People had their free will caused them to do evil and also did not have them help and save other people. Therefore, it's a good philosophy for the sense of saying that God isn't responsible for really terrible things that happen in the world. It's very difficult to understand this, to be honest with you, because when you look at, the Torah itself, it does speak there about God doing, these different the things, God having vengeance, and God punishing us for not doing the right thing. So it's hard to understand that. To understand Rambam's position on God and evil, we have to understand Rambam's position on divine providence. There are basically two opposite spheres in divine providence. Actually, Maimonides brings down 5 different opinions in the Guide to the Perplexed about what divine providence is or isn't, and then he explains one of them, which he believes is the correct Jewish opinion. The far extreme of believing in God and divine providence is the Aristotelian view that God created the world and left it behind. The Rambam on the first Torah in Bereshis also speaks about this view. In Hebrew, it's called kadmoniot or kadmonos, that God created the world and left it behind. And now he's just running the world through chance, through the intermediary spheres in the world, that the physics or whatever, that things are running according to things. God created the world and left it behind, and now it's just running according to course. The opposite view would seem to be the Baal Shem Tov view, and maybe the view of the Kabbalists as well, that God is responsible for every single detail of the world. You could go even as far as Ishbitzer, which says that even free will is just an illusion. There really is no free will. That's a natural conclusion of the feeling that God is responsible for the world. Nevertheless, it's hard to go that extreme because we see Rabbi Akiva in Pirkei Avos says God both knows what's going to happen and there's free will. And it's a conundrum. It's part of life that we can't understand. And no philosopher has ever been able to answer that question, so I won't go into length at it. I won't go into length at it here at this point. Anyway, Maimonides is somewhere in the middle. He believes that God, again, is totally removed from this world, and the world and God are a separate sphere, and therefore God is infinite and awesome and spiritual and beyond and out of this world. But yet God does interact and relate to this world. God's hashgacha relates to this world. Generally, God runs the world in a general way, what we call hashgacha klalis, like an overall providence to make sure that things happen the right way. But for those select individuals, and we see throughout the guide that Maimonides has a rather elitist opinion that there are only certain select individuals that are capable of rising to certain high levels. I guess you'd call that the tzaddik, the righteous person. The more we invest, the more we connect to God, the more intellectual awareness of divinity, the more God is going to rest his light, his hashgacha on us. Others would say that may be true for as many mitzvahs that we do. Maimonides, though, in the guide seems to be pretty much focused, however, not on the mitzvahs that we do. He's not obviously not against mitzvahs. He wrote a ton about the mitzvahs in other books. But his main avoda, the main spiritual quest for Maimonides is the quest to find God, the spiritual God beyond all. And to the degree which a person perfects himself is the degree in which God will have providence on him. So a general person is just basically stuck in the world of chance, according to Maimonides. God's not completely removed, like Aristotle says, but God's not involved to all the degree that the Baal Shem Tov and others say, and that most people believe is the folk religion of Judaism, that God's responsible for everything. 2 obvious philosophical questions come in at this point. The first one would be if God's the creator, he would know everything that's going to happen. If I create a computer program and I have infinite knowledge of it, I'm going to know that everything that happens in the world. So God is responsible for a way in everything that happens in the world. It's not just the nature of the world and free will which creates evil. Right? That's one problem with it. And that seems to, again, harken back to Baal Shem Tov's opinion that God's responsible for everything that happens in the world. And the second problem would basically be on one hand, Rambam says people have the free will to do evil, either to themselves or to others. And on the other hand, we say that God has direct divine providence on those people who have perfected themselves. So how do those two interact? Meaning does God only have divine providence on things which he controls? Or will God overcome somebody's free will in order to bring a certain result? Meaning I have free will to hurt somebody, but because that person's a perfected person, God will step in to make sure that doesn't happen. That's the second question. So to wrap up here in this video about Rambam's view on divine providence and evil, there's three causes of evil in the world that Rambam brings here in the Guide to the Perplexed. The first one is, as we spoke, the materialistic nature of the world, that this world is materialistic, and therefore it's gonna corrupt, it's gonna fall apart. But Rambam adds a caveat there, and he actually kind of says in a way, maybe this isn't truly evil in itself. Because even though the world falls apart, nevertheless, he says, all birth comes from death. Those wasn't his exact language, but he says all coming into being comes from disappearing. Meaning is, he recognizes that things disintegrate and fall apart in the earth. Food and water and stuff, it's constantly being recycled, that builds new things. So the great good, which is new creation, new life, only comes about through death. And this seems to be very similar to his idea of, if you look at the greater purpose of the world, you see that it's very good. If we focus in on the individual and how there's loss in the world, that does seem bad. But we have to see the greater good, right? And the second two courses, the second two reasons for evil in the world, again, are just related to Rambam's view on free will. Free will being an absolute axiom, he says, people hurt each other all the time. Evil is caused by the tyranny of men one to another. But also Rambam tries to get rid of those who are nihilists and say, even this is rare. It's rare. Generally, most of the world is run in a normal way. People are generally healthy. People generally don't suffer excessively. And even things like war, which brings robbery and rape and murder, those things are rare occurrences and only happen in a small time for a few amount of people. And you still have to say, overall, that God is good. It's interesting because we say God is all good, but Rambam is trying to say here, well, we have to look at it as percentages. God's mostly what happens in the world is good, right? God's all good, but even in the world itself, which is removed from God, it's mostly good. And the last opinion, which is the most sobering, is that we are responsible for evil ourselves. Meaning is we make bad decisions. If we don't exercise and we eat garbage food, we should expect there will be certain results in the world. If we're not going to make the effort to look for a job or look for a mate or do good things, or if in the converse, if we say bad things and hurt people, why should we be surprised that we're not saved, that we're not doing good things? Free will and materialism, the material nature of the world, the corruptible material nature of the world are the reasons why there's evil in the world. And we have to accept and understand those things, that most of evil is caused by that, and that we bring evil, and even bring evil upon ourselves. And again, the advantages of this philosophy are, one, people are held accountable. We can hold the Nazis, Yamak Shemam, accountable. We can't say, where was God in the Holocaust? We can say, people did evil. We can say, people didn't step up to save other people, right? I hate to use such an extreme example, but I did, right? It was about free will. But it also is important for us. If we look at our sad situations, difficult things in our lives, it forces us to take responsibility and grow and accept that maybe things were our fault, right? I guess we can blame other people too, which is a problem. We can say, this person did this to me. That's a problem of this philosophy. We say, this person did this to me, and it wasn't God's will, it was this person. Therefore, I can have resentment against this person. That should be another potential flaw. But the advantage is we can also look at ourselves and stop projecting everything on others in God only and say, you know what, we are somewhat responsible for the evil that happens to ourselves. So that is, in a nutshell, Rambam's philosophy. God is totally incorporeal and removed from this world. This world is a material world. God's all good. This world is mostly good, but that the evil that's found in this world is from a privation, a lack of good. God does not create that. God creates the good, and the lack of that good is in the fact that this world is moving towards entropy. The material nature of this world is that it breaks down, is why we see evil. And also the axiom of free will, that we have free will and others have free will, and that can cause evil in the world. It's a radically different opinion than the Baal Shem Tov's opinion and others who believe that God is responsible for every bit in the world. Though I want you to note, to be fair, the Baal Shem Tov does say that God does not create evil as well. But that's for another video. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit about Rambam's philosophy. This is Adam Law with Wanderings, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe if you want more content, and we will see you next time. Thank you.